Well, welcome. You made it through what is probably the most labor-intensive week of your curriculum. There may be one more that's a little bit like this, but you did it, which also means that you've made it through the most labor-intensive part of the whole year. So, yay! Thanks for hanging in. Not only, of course, was this a lot of labor, but of course these are hard and difficult topics. So when you put the two together, I know that we asked a lot of you this week. But I just wanted to kind of go back to something we said at the beginning of Leviticus, and it really struck me that this was true this week. You know, we talked about Leviticus being like mining, and I'm picturing if you have had kids that you've taken, grandkids, nephews, to the mountains in North Carolina, and you can do that little gem mining where they take the silt through and you sift it, and then sometimes it's all fake and they've put gems in there, but sometimes it's real and you're looking for, pretty stones that are in the silt. There is a lot of mining required in this text, but the gems are beautiful. And that's what I hope to show you today. So just to orient you, remember that we are in Leviticus 18 and 20. If you want to look at our badges, we are in the section, Laws About Moral Purity. And what's interesting about this section, and what I hope you've noticed, is that, of course, all of Leviticus is a chiasm. Chiasms are all over Leviticus. The editor who put all of these speeches of Moses together really liked the chiasm structure. And if you can bring up the next slide, what you'll see is that the laws about moral purity mirror the laws about ritual purity. These are the two sections of the text that the Lord addresses to the people, not to Moses and Aaron exclusively, but to the people. So you see what's marked up there. In this case, it's marked personal laws, purification, and cleansing. That was 11 through 15. That was the everyday people, not the priest, what they were supposed to do. And then 18 through 20, and really in our for our purposes, 17 as well. How do you handle blood, and how do we handle worship in all of life? Do you want me to just turn that off? You probably can't if I don't, unlock it. So, 18 through 20, how to worship God in all of life. 11 through 15 was about how to make yourself ritually clean, how to approach the temple. This is in all of life. How do we mirror the Lord to a watching world? So let's just dive in Leviticus 18, 1 through 5. I'm going to read the first 5 verses because this really is the sum and foundation of everything that's to come. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, I am the Lord your God. You shall not do as they do in the land of Egypt where you lived, and you shall not do as they do in the land of Canaan, to which I am bringing you. You shall not walk in their statutes. You shall follow my rules and keep my statutes and walk in them. I am the Lord your God. You shall therefore keep my statutes and my rules. If a person does them, he shall live by them. I am the Lord. Okay, so we see here that the Lord frames his law based on his relationship with the people. He's reminding them of his redemptive work and the covenant he made with them. Look at verse 2. Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, I am the Lord your God. That phrase comes up so much in Leviticus that sometimes we can just breeze right past it. But in those few words, that's like shorthand for amazing truths about who God is that he's wanting them to remember as they listen to what follows. He's saying, I am Yahweh, your God. Some scholars have noted that this formula is actually similar to other Near Eastern covenant treaties of the time. So it's appropriate for us to continue looking at these instructions as part of the terms of the covenant the Lord was calling the Israelites to at Sinai. Remember, this has been a long slog for us in Exodus and Leviticus and in Exodus. They are still at Sinai. They are still at the base of the mountain. They are still receiving instructions for what it looks like to be the people of God. They haven't even been told yet that they have to wait 40 years to go to Canaan. Okay, they don't know any of that. They haven't even embarked on the wandering. They are still at Mount Sinai receiving the words of the Lord. And this short phrase, I am the Lord, really sums up, if you want to just mark these verses, in Exodus 6 through 7, where the Lord says, I've called you, I rescued you, and like Leviticus 11:44, where in rescuing them, he calls them to be holy as he is holy. So this phrase, I am the Lord your God, is where he's actually giving the reason over and over again. Why am I asking these things of you? Because I am the Lord your God. I'm your covenant king who called you out of slavery and called you to holiness for my purposes and my glory. As Gordon Wenham put it, in this very short formula, the Israelites were constantly reminded who they were and whom they served. Who they were, their identity. Whom they served, their purpose. And let's just stop right here for a second. Isn't this what we're all looking for? Our identity and our purpose? This is what covenant relationship with the Lord brings, and this is true of us today in Christ. Our identity and purpose are found in Christ under his rule and reign. But he defines the terms. He defines for us what flourishing looks like as the people of God who are called to be holy. Remember, the Lord first proposed to the people of Israel, drawing them into this covenant in Exodus. And when he did that, in a verse that we've gone back to over and over again, he called them to be a kingdom of priests. We see that in Exodus 19:4 through 6. And I'm not going to read it, but you remember he called them to be a kingdom of priests and his treasured possession. And in much of Leviticus, we've actually been focusing on the role of the priest. Remember, a priest, of course, represents the people before God. But remember, there's another key role of the priest, which is representing God, showing who God is to the people. And if you remember, we saw this distinction between these roles, even in the different clothing that the high priest was called to wear at different points during the Day of Atonement. When he was in the Holy of Holies, the most holy place, where he was alone before the presence of the Lord, he wore only his simple linen garments. When he came out to represent the Lord to the people, he wore dazzling clothes designed to point to the glory and grandeur of Yahweh, the King of Kings. So when the text tells us that the people were meant to be a kingdom of priests, it's emphasizing this second aspect, that they are meant to reflect the dazzling glory of the Lord to a watching world. This call to be a light or a blessing to the nations, that's the wording that was used by the Lord in his original covenant with Abraham. This is what the Lord is zeroing in on in these chapters. So there's a few more things that I want to note in this first section. In verse 3 and 4, the Lord makes it clear that in order to be this light and this blessing, they have to leave behind the ways of their past and be set apart from the culture that they're going to. They have to leave behind the ways of Egypt, and they have to not adopt the land of Canaan. The Lord is their God, and he is to define how they are to behave. This aspect of avoiding the other cultures around them, the Lord repeats this 7 times in chapter 18 alone. So we know that this is part of his focus. Being the set-apart people of God means being different from what they left behind and different from the land that they're going to. The text goes on, if they actually follow these instructions in verse 5, the person who does them shall live by them. Now, of course, the living here isn't just like physical life. What's called to mind here is that abundant, flourishing life that we have under the Lord's blessing. Keeping the law of God is our path to flourishing. But of course, we know that the law is not a way to earn the Lord's favor. The law is how the people of God can become who they were meant to be. The law provides the path to life and flourishing and shows them the way to fulfill their purpose as a light and a blessing to the nations. And the way I often think about it is the law is like a fence. And I don't know if you've seen these studies or you just know this from your own experience, but they've shown that if you send kids outside into a big backyard where there is no fence, the kids will hover near the center of that yard and not take advantage of all the space. But when you put a fence in place, they take full advantage of all of the space that's available to them, because the fence tells them what is safe and secure, and they can experience great freedom in that space. This is what God's law is like. And we've spent a lot of time on this because this framing is really essential for properly interpreting the instructions that follow. Remember, as you saw in your study this week, the Lord did not choose them because they were already following his law. Oh, I see in you. You already see things the way I see it, people of Israel. Like, why don't you be my people? Right? That's not why he called them. He didn't call them because they were strong. You saw that in Deuteronomy 7 when you studied this week. Rather, he chose them because they were the ones through whom his character and glory were going to be on display. As Michael Morales put it, Israel's own enjoyment of God, as well as their mission from God to the nations, was contingent upon this one goal of holiness, of Israel becoming the treasured possession of God. Well, what follows in verse 6 on is a long list of who the Israelites could and could not have sex with. That's how it reads, right? And it is extensive, exhaustive, a bit exhausting. When we were preparing for Leviticus way back last May, I remember coming home and puzzling over this with my husband. We were going to sleep one night. I was like, I mean, the Lord spends a long time telling people who not to have sex with. Why in the world do you think he did that? We tossed around some different things. And that's what I hope to show you today. Why in the world does he spend so much time talking about sex? So as you saw in your study, the phrase uncover the nakedness of is a euphemism for sex, but not just for sex. In this context, we think it's telling us who the people could and could not marry. In this culture, people were not having sex outside of marriage very often. You have the village, everybody can see everybody's business. This is who they could marry and who they couldn't. Nonetheless, the fact that there is so much sex in this chapter is a bit shocking for us today, right? Just like we saw in Leviticus 15, the Bible does shock us a bit with the ease with which it speaks about the most personal and intimate parts of our lives. And here again, we see the mercy of the Lord on display. He loves all of who we are, and all of what he offers to us in his good way is for his glory. There's nothing that's off limits from his eyes, from his law, from what he wants for us in terms of flourishing. So these boundary lines for who we could and could not marry, remember he said, leave behind Egypt and don't adopt Canaan. We know from archaeological and historical studies that many of these rules were different in Egypt and they were different in Canaan. The Egyptians had brothers and sisters marry all the time. The Canaanites had all sorts of rules. Some of the rules are the same, some are different. But it is clear that it was necessary for the Lord to define for his people what was in bounds and what was out of bounds. Because remember, they had been in Egypt for 400 years, swimming in a culture that was not the Lord's. Also, in affirming which family members were out of bounds, the text is assuming something that's really foreign to us. It's assuming that you're going to marry in your clan. So I have to tell you how close you can be and how close not to be, because the assumption is actually you are going to marry somebody who's somewhat related to you. So let's make sure it's not so close. That's totally foreign to us. But remember, at this time, this was a culture that's very tribal. It's the way things work. Abraham sent his servants back to his homeland to find a wife for Isaac. This is the way the culture operated, and so they needed to know where those lines would be drawn. And this is God's mercy. God's not a gotcha God. He doesn't leave his requirements as a mystery. We don't have to guess what pleases him. He tells us out of his mercy and grace. So Leviticus 18:6 is a summary text for what follows. None of you shall approach any one of his close relatives to uncover nakedness. I am the Lord. In other words, you may not marry a close relative. And everything else is going to be a specific example of what the Lord means by that. And the reason for that is given in verse 10. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your son's daughter or of your daughter's daughter, for their nakedness is your own nakedness. So that's the reason for their nakedness is your own nakedness. So what does that mean? Well, this is a literal translation of a Hebrew idiom, because she is your nakedness. If we were to say the same thing, we might say, she's your own flesh and blood. Like, we have that in our culture too. So this is literally what the text is saying. You cannot marry this category of people because they are your own flesh and blood. So that part makes sense to us. What doesn't make sense for us in all of these cases is who God defines as being your own flesh and blood. But let's go back to unpack this. Let's go back to Genesis when the Lord creates Eve. In Genesis 2, after the Lord creates Eve, Adam erupts in a poem of love and praise. In Genesis 2:23, it starts, "Then the man said, 'This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of man. Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh.' And the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed." This is how the Bible envisions marriage, a mystical union where two distinct human beings become one flesh, and in the midst of that union, one can be naked and unashamed. So think about even the word the Bible uses here, uncover the nakedness of. The Lord is saying these are the people, if you enter into marriage with him, before whom you can be naked and unashamed. Everybody else is off limits. And this vision for marriage persisted after the fall, and we know this because in Genesis 9:7, the Lord reiterated his command to be fruitful and multiply in his act of recreation after the flood of judgment. And this vision of marriage that emphasizes this mystical one-flesh union was reaffirmed by Jesus in Matthew 19. Starting in verse 3 of Matthew 19, it reads, "And the Pharisees came up to him and tested him by asking, 'Is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause?' And he answered, 'Have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh?'" Okay, so that's where Jesus leaves off, quoting Genesis, and then Jesus gives his own commentary right here. "So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate." We know that phrase. You've been to a lot of weddings, but think about what God is saying here in marriage. This is two become one flesh. That's kind of crazy. I don't know of other cultures, I didn't go look this up, where marriage is actually envisioned that way. But there is a union that happens in marriage that is precious to God, and Jesus uses that same language and re-emphasizes it himself in his commentary. So these chapters are actually a beautiful elaboration of this principle. The Lord is defining for his people which relationships can experience this beautiful one-fleshness of marriage in which they can be naked and unashamed. And this principle is really straightforward. Thank you for doing the hard work in your chart this week. I know that was a bear, but that keeps us from having to walk through all those relationships up here now. You've got all that straight if you did the work of your chart. And I also wanted to say, just so you know, I hate charts. When I'm doing a curriculum, I'm the person that hates the charts. And I'm the one for whom the charts are there, because I will just breeze past all those details. I'm like, yeah, I got it. And the chart makes me slow down and, okay, this is what the text really says. So if you do hate the charts, I'm with you, and thank you for doing it. But with all of those details, you saw the basic principle. When you are already flesh and blood with another, with a close family member by blood or by marriage, if you are already flesh and blood, then you can't marry. If you aren't, you can. So in all of those details, that's the simple principle. What's striking is that being related to someone by marriage is the same as being related to them by blood. And that only makes sense because the Lord says, in marriage, the two become one flesh. So when two become one flesh, those two people are now related by blood, even though biologically, I'm a biologist, genetically, that's not true. But it's true spiritually in God's economy, in God's space. The two become one. And so, my husband's brothers are my brothers, even though I am not genetically related to them at all. In doing this, the Lord is really elevating what happens in marriage, right? He's taking a transactional relationship and making it a manifestation of the same union that we see in the Trinity. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself. We'll get there in a minute. These two laws also had two practical benefits that J. Sklar notes. So there's this overarching elevation of marriage itself, this mystical union that makes people who are related by marriage as if they were related by blood. There's that big principle. And then there's two very practical things. They protected vulnerable children and women from being preyed upon by a close relative. You know, a woman had to go into the whole household of her husband, and it protected her from other men thinking that she was available to them as well. That would have been awful. And it also helped protect the unity of the family unit. If everybody's clear on who you can marry and who you can't, you don't have relationships cropping up within it that are a little off and a little iffy and creating division, and then how's the property going to get divided? Everything's very clear, which helps maintain the unity of his people. Now, briefly, I want to comment on verse 18. In the ESV, it reads, "You shall not take a woman as a rival wife to her sister, uncovering her nakedness while her sister is still alive." Some scholars, and this includes some ancient Jewish scholars around the time of Christ, actually interpret verse 18 as a prohibition against polygamy, because the verse literally says, "Do not take," which means marry, "do not take a woman in addition to her sister." The way the phrase "in addition to" is used, I'm not a linguist, but I'm trusting the scholars that have done that work. The way that phrase "in addition to" is used actually leaves open the possibility that the meaning of this verse is, do not marry a woman in addition to another. Do not marry a woman in addition to another. This is God's ideal. I think the narrative of Scripture kind of demonstrates that polygamy is a really bad idea. We see that demonstrated, but here it might actually be stated. Every scholar doesn't agree with that, but I find that somewhat persuasive. All right, now let's focus on 18, 19 through 23. This list represents a shift from a discussion of who the Israelites could and could not marry to very specific practices, some of them mostly outside of marriage, that were forbidden. Verse 19 forbids having sex with a woman during her period. This is similar to, but a little different from what we saw in Leviticus 15. Verse 20 prohibits adultery, also prohibited in the Ten Commandments. Verse 21, child sacrifice, which is especially heinous because it profanes the name of the Lord. To profane the name of the Lord is to deny his holiness and act completely contrary to his character. Right? If the Israelites were supposed to show who he was, then child sacrifice profanes that name. They are showing exactly the opposite of who he is. Verse 22 is the prohibition against homosexuality, and verse 23 is the prohibition against bestiality. And each of these practices are called out because they were documented practices among either Egyptian or Canaanite cultures. Remember, the Lord said, don't walk that way, don't walk this way. And he's especially saying, and especially in these ways, do not do this. Each of these is incompatible with the holy living that the Lord called the Israelites to embrace. Now for us, only two of these commandments, if you just walked up to somebody on the street, like if you went to, especially if you went to UNC, you're walking along Franklin Street, right? Like how many of these do you think are still wrong today? Two, maybe? Like, right? This is not the prevailing view of our culture, this list of commands. And I don't know if you have seen this, but even since Christmas, some major New York publications are promoting polyamory, open marriages where people have multiple encounters and it's fine and everybody's fulfilled in this. So, what we have to wrestle with as God's people amidst a culture that thinks very differently about marriage and sexuality, are these laws applicable to us today? Or were they just, we've talked about this, Leviticus has cultural accommodation. Leviticus, is the Lord speaking into the culture of a time and making his point. Well, how do we know? What's the difference? And some of the how we know, like Aaron's going to deal with next week, because some of the laws that are more clearly that we don't have to follow today are in Aaron's section next week. So I'm going to save a full treatment of if you want to think of a rubric, we'll save that for next week. But even without that rubric, this text itself, in conjunction with its exposition in the New Testament, does not give us the freedom to just toss it out as something cultural of the time. It's just not a faithful reading of this text. Well, what do I mean by this? Well, you saw in your study the New Testament authors, and we didn't go through everything, but you looked at many of these verses. The New Testament authors explicitly or implicitly affirm 4 of these 5 commands. So you already have Jesus or the apostles speaking in and saying, yep, this is still outside of God's path of flourishing. So let's take these one by one, and I'm going to go pretty fast. So if you miss some of these, come back to me afterwards. I'd be happy to give this to you. In verse 20, of course, we have adultery. Of course, it's in the 10 Commandments, but in Matthew 15, Jesus expressly calls it out. In Matthew 15, starting in verse 18, he says, "But what comes out of the mouth proceeds from the heart, and this defiles a person. For out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false witness, and slander. These are what defile a person." So here, Jesus explicitly puts adultery and sexual immorality more broadly in this category of sins of the heart that ritually defile a person. And now that you've been in Leviticus all these weeks, isn't it really interesting that Jesus keeps that language of defiling? He maintains that language of being unclean. But what makes someone unclean isn't just these practices, but the heart from which these practices emerge. In Matthew 19, we just read one section of 19, but in Matthew 19, 16 through 19, Jesus does something very similar where he affirms that the law against adultery applies to us all, and I'm not going to read that one. Well, what about child sacrifice? Well, the New Testament does not actually directly mention child sacrifice. It had largely died out as a practice at the time of Jesus, but Jesus does address murder. And so I think it's pretty safe to say that child sacrifice would fall under the category of murder. Okay, verse 22, the homosexuality provision. This is also forbidden in the New Testament. While Jesus himself never directly addressed the issue, as we read earlier in Matthew 19, he called special attention to the fact that marriage is between a male and a female. I have not read anything of this. This is just like parentheses, Michelle's crazy thought. I think it's really interesting that the words here are male and female and not man and woman. Did the Lord in some crazy way anticipate the confusion that would abound in our culture? And he's referring back to biological terms so that there would be no confusion. That's just Michelle's crazy. Take it for what it might not be. Male and female. So he also really highlighted and affirmed God's pre-fall purpose in creation, and it's just hard to see how homosexuality would fit in the words that I just read to you when he affirmed the one fleshness of marriage being between male and female. Paul famously addressed homosexuality in Romans 1, 26 through 27, and you saw that in your study this week, and we're going to come back to Romans 1 in a minute. And Paul also clearly identifies homosexuality as sin in 1 Corinthians 6:9 and 1 Timothy 1:10. Now, I have an article here. We have a few copies of this in the back. This is where I got some of what I'm going to talk about. This is a very technical treatment from the New Testament why homosexuality is forbidden by the New Testament. So if you're talking to someone who says, no, that's not what the New Testament says, here's a scholar writing in technical, scholarly, commentary-like way about that. So we have copies about that if that's interesting or helpful to you. And one of the things that this is, Thomas Schreiner wrote this article. One of the things that Thomas Schreiner points out is that the Greek word that Paul uses for homosexuality in 1 Corinthians 6:9 and 1 Timothy 1:10, it's used for the very first time in all of Greek literature here in Paul's letters. But the word is actually drawn from the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of Leviticus that Paul would have known and used. So Paul picks up the very word for homosexuality that's used here in Leviticus and uses that word in his letter to the Corinthians and Timothy rather than the word that was circulating in Greek at the time for that practice. So I think he was deliberately pulling the Leviticus prohibition into his commentary in Corinthians and Timothy. But you can read more about that in this article. Bestiality is not mentioned by name in the New Testament, but almost as certainly is covered by Paul's lists in Romans of the consequences for people and societies who give themselves over to being controlled by sexual desire. So, for four of the five commands in the list, we have solid reaffirmation by the New Testament that these practices are not part of God's flourishing for his people. So with that in view, what do we do with verse 19? The prohibition of having sex with a woman while she's on her period. This is not mentioned anywhere in the New Testament. It's not really covered by any of those verses or practices that I mentioned before, so what do we do with this? And even if we're really carefully looking at this, verse 19 seems inconsistent with Leviticus 15:24. So if you remember when I taught on Leviticus 15, if a man and a woman had sex while the woman was on her period, 7 days of cleansing, that's it, that's all you need. And here, if you jump ahead to 20 verse 18, death. Whoa, that's a bit different. Like, why the difference? Most scholars think that what Leviticus 15 is talking about is a man and a woman are having sex and they happen to discover that she started her period. Whereas here, and I think in the context this makes sense, these practices listed here are not one-off, oh, I slipped. These are like acts of rebellion against God's order where people are choosing to walk. Remember, if you look back at 1-5 of chapter 18, these are practices that you're walking in, that you're actively choosing to engage in, not slips, not accidents, not things that happen to you either. So the thought is that given all of what Elizabeth taught us last week about blood, to knowingly have sex with a woman on her period with all of the sacredness of blood that the Lord was using to communicate essential truths in that context, that would have been a violation of the Lord's good. But all of that blood is now in Jesus, covered in Jesus, and I haven't found any commentaries or scholars that think that this actually applies to us today, because the very root and reason of the prohibition is the blood ceremony of the laws that no longer apply to us in the rituals of the tabernacle and the temple. That said, I think there's plenty of room for doubt. The Bible just isn't super clear for us on this, and that's why I'm not comfortable bringing it in and saying, oh, this is binding on Christians today, because we just really don't know. Scholars really aren't sure what that means. So, okay, we've got all of these practices. So what I'm hoping that you see is in elevating marriage to this one flesh mystical union that is so real that it creates blood relationships between people who were not previously blood related. In that context, listing these practices and their reaffirmation in the New Testament is how we know that this is part of God's grand purpose of flourishing that's part of his created order. This is not like, well, we'll see next week, don't get tattoos. Aaron will deal with that next week. God is going back to the very creation itself and why we were made. Why were we made? To be in union with him and to demonstrate the union that he has within the Trinity with one another through marriage, through our family relationships, and by being fruitful and multiplying. So this even child sacrifice, why is child sacrifice so heinous? Well, of course, it's atrocious, killing a child. We instinctively know that. But the Lord had intended his blessing to be extended over all the earth by the people having children. Like, that was the plan. The plan was Adam and Eve, before the fall, were going to have children, and the blessing of the Lord was going to spread over the earth. The Lord's blessing of marriage and children is like essential to how he wanted the very love that he had within himself in the Trinity to just spill over into creation, into all of our lives. If the garden is a temple, the mystical unions of male and female in marriage that overflows into the multiplication of children are the beams that hold the structure in place and make the unity of humanity, both our horizontal unity and our unity with the Lord, make sense. It's how the Lord intended things to operate. This does not mean that you have to be married or have children to experience union with Christ or the blessing of the Lord's presence in his people. That's not at all what the Lord is talking about. We sometimes can start reading things that way because we think so individualistically. That's not what the Lord had in mind. The Lord had was talking about creating a society, a people in which the love of the Trinity was spilling over all over the place. into marriage, and into children. But that doesn't mean that each individual is going to experience that in the same way. But by having a whole society and a whole people that's cultured that way, I mean, think about it, pre-fall, if this is the way the world operated, if a woman didn't have children, she would have been so deeply connected to the world around her, I don't think there would have been any lack, right? She wouldn't have felt lesser. She would have been experiencing the fullness of the blessing that was the water she was swimming in. You know, in the Psalms, it says, the Lord places the lonely in families. Well, there have to be families for the Lord to place the lonely in. That's kind of part of what I'm getting at. He wants a structure that has all of his love overflowing in it, so that as individuals, whether that's whether our experience is to extend that love or to receive that love, we're all experiencing God's blessing. In fact, because this structure is so central to creation, creation itself responds when God's ways are ignored and upended. And I don't know, when you got to verse 28, I don't know if you found this, but it's a little shocking for us. The land is going to vomit you out. That's not how we tend to think about land and place. In fact, in our culture now, we've largely lost our sense of place. But there is no physical, spiritual, or sacred secular divide in God's kingdom. All of creation is the Lord's. And again, because this chapter is actually going back to Genesis, his very created order, the land that God created vomits inhabitants out if they don't adopt the blessing and flourishing path that he laid out. It's all connected because it's all part of creation. We are part of creation. The land is part of creation. Children are part of creation. You cannot compartmentalize sin. If there's anything that we've learned in Leviticus so far, it ought to be that, right? We cannot compartmentalize sin. Sin will poison us, body and soul. This is why the fall introduced physical death and why death separates us for a time from this physical world. But when Christ comes again to restore all things, the new heaven and the new earth is going to be physical, created, and embodied. And that's just like a preview. Put a pin in that because the land is going to feature prominently in this whole second half of Leviticus. And of course, this is not merely a quirk of the nation of Israel that Jesus cast aside. Paul tells us in Romans 8, and I don't have time to read it, but that the whole creation is groaning for redemption. So just as we feel the now and not yet, the land, the created order, feels the now and not yet. All right, moving on to 20. Leviticus 20 reiterates all of the instructions of chapter 18 with consequences added for violating these rules. Verse 2 makes it clear that the instructions, and I skipped over this because we're just going to talk about it as a bundle right here. But at the end of chapter 18 and here in verse 2, the Lord makes it clear that the instructions that follow apply equally to the Israelites and to the strangers who sojourn in Israel. The practices forbidden here are so contrary to the plans and purposes of God that they aren't permitted anywhere in God's kingdom, even by people who don't consider themselves part of God's family. And though 18 and 20 largely deal with the same practices, the chapters are structured differently. In chapter 18, it was written in the form of a covenant treaty. And let me go back. I forgot to do this earlier. Yes. So 18 through 20. This is why we're skipping 19, because 18 through 20 is a chiasm within the whole chiasm of the Old Testament. So you see that, and you saw this when you read, right? Like you read 20 and you're like, didn't I just read that in 18? Yes. And so that's why we're doing them together. And then you can go ahead and go to the next slide. Not that one. Yes, this one. But 20 is its own chiasm. 18 is not a chiasm. 18 is a covenant treaty, which adopts whatever structures covenant treaties have. But 20 is also a chiasm. You have verses 2 through 6, forbidden idolatrous practices and consequences. And then in verse 27, which seems like a random add-on, but they did it for the chiasm, forbidden idolatrous practices and consequences. The center is the repeated text, 9 through 21, forbidden marriages, family structures, and consequences. But that is framed in verse 7 through 8 and 22 through 26, with God giving us the reason, this call to holiness and for being a set-apart people. And I just want to say, we have said before, the structure of a text tells us its emphasis. And I would argue that this text goes even farther. The structure of the text is actually like the cipher that helps you unlock the code. When you see it, when you just read straight through, like the first time I was talking to my husband, like, what in the world? It's just like, who you can't have sex with and then you're going to die? Like, this is crazy. But when you look at the structure like this, you see that the Lord is creating a set-apart people and that family and marriage is central to creating that set-apart people. So the structure is actually what leads to the interpretation that we're talking about today. So just so that you know that we're talking about the same thing, you probably noticed if you are a detail-oriented person, I'm not, but I'm training myself to be, Aaron is, we're a good team. You probably noticed that lies with is used here, whereas 18 is uncover the nakedness of. But the text is very gracious and gives us the code. I'm telling you, it's like the cipher is like written down for us. In verse 11, we have the code. In verse 11 of chapter 20, if a man lies with his father's wife, he has uncovered his father's nakedness. Oh, lies with means uncovers the nakedness. Great. Because the focus of this is the consequences, he's going to use the shorthand lies with in most of these verses. But in verse 11, he was gracious enough to tell us what he means. All right. So, same emphasis, the Lord's holiness is visibly expressed by staying within the bounds of the Lord's design for marriage and family, and by avoiding the idolatrous practices of the surrounding nations. And with this emphasis in view, we also see that why the additional commands that appear in chapter 20 but aren't in 18 are not just randomly inserted. They're chosen because they fit within this broader theme. So you notice in verse 6 and verse 27, if a person turns to mediums or necromancers, and 27, also mediums and necromancers. So those are people who claim to speak to the dead. It's demonic, it's idolatrous, and it is so opposed to the Lord because he doesn't want us to pursue any power apart from him. Who is our help? Who is our aid? Only the Lord. And he feels so strongly about that in a whole chapter about marriage and family, what's the image he uses in verse 6? Whoring after. If we pursue God's power or any sort of spiritual power apart from the Lord, that's treason and adultery to our covenant king. And in verse 9, we have this verse about cursing his father or mother. In our context, that does not just mean using swear words to your parents. That's not what's in view here. This is really serious. In an honor-shamed culture where family is so important, this means completely rejecting your parents and literally heaping the Lord's curse on your parents. Not random. Necromancers, not following the Lord and his purposes. Family, parents, again, it's not just marriage, right? It's children and family in the whole structure. So cursing your parents is subverting the very love overflow blessing that the Lord wants to image to the world. We've already talked about the essence of the rest of the commands. So without going through each one, we're just going to highlight a little bit about the consequences that are listed here, because that's really the focus. First, I want you to notice that child sacrifice is far and away the most offensive practice listed in these chapters. It gets the most real estate, it's the worst. And it is both idolatrous and an affront to the image of God in each child. It is a defiant rebellion against the original command to be fruitful and multiply. It is a selfish attempt to appease some God whose character is not the Lord's and give up that which is meant to be the precious vehicle of his blessing to the world. It is utterly opposed to everything he stands for. And so, a community that tolerated such idolatrous injustice could not be called by the Lord's name. And so the community itself was called to police this particular practice. That's really interesting, isn't it? It didn't say, it could be the priest, right? The priest is the one who's sort of policing worship. So why not make the priest the one who has to put to death the idolater? the child sacrifice was something that he wanted the community to be on guard against, because he wanted the whole community to be his vehicle of blessing and love. They were their brother's keepers. They needed to help each other guard against this most heinous practice. And so the whole community had to be involved in issuing the punishment. And just a note on that, we're going to talk about this in a minute, but Elizabeth mentioned this last week. These are deterrents. These consequences almost never had to be enacted because they were laid down, right? If I tell you you're going to die if you do something, you're probably not going to do it. This is, again, the Lord's grace. He's not whimsical. He's not capricious. He's not making it up as he goes. The people are very clear about what he expected of them, and he was very clear that child sacrifice was not it. And so I think here's a place where we can see clear application. We have children in our culture that are being sacrificed to the gods of money and pleasure. Like, trafficking is a real thing in our state. Like, we as a community should be on guard and should be helping to guard against that, even in people that we don't know. This is so heinous to the Lord. But more broadly, there are 3 consequences listed in this chapter: being put to death, being cut off, and having no descendants. Now, as Elizabeth said last week, scholars don't all agree on what being cut off means. But if you think about what we've said so far, that the Lord is, he's created this outpost of Eden in his people. And within that outpost of Eden, he wanted this marriages to thrive. He wanted his people to be fruitful and multiply. Being cut off is the same as being exiled from Eden, whether that's physical death or whether that's spiritual death or whether that's just being separated from the community. In the end, it's kind of all the same. And also, Elizabeth made this point last week, these are practices that you walk in, not one-off, oh, I slipped. You don't just accidentally sacrifice a child, right? So these are, like, when someone has gone that way, and Romans is going to hit on this, and we're talking about this in a minute. When someone is doing this, they have essentially walked out of the garden themselves. These are people that have been rescued out of Egypt and given this special blessing of being the ones to whom God revealed what true life really is. And they have that gift. And so these consequences are for people who've said, screw you, Lord, I'm doing it my way. I'm walking out. So they seem really harsh to us, but the rejection is also very deep that the Lord is judging here. Essentially, what is happening is treason. And even in our culture, treason is punishable by death. Remember, the Lord rescued them and announced his character as one of steadfast love and mercy. So when they're walking out on that, they're saying, I don't believe that you're a God of steadfast love and mercy. I don't believe that you know what's best for me. I'm doing it my way. I'm going out on my own. And the result is separation from God. But that's what they chose by walking out of God's blessing. So read what Romans has to say about this. Paul really, and I think reading it in these terms helps us make sense of this part of Romans too, which also can be pretty off-putting. So if you put Leviticus and Romans together, think about what Paul is saying. In chapter 1, starting in verse 21, he's talking about people, all people. For although they, people on earth, knew God, and he's talking about the way that God had revealed himself in our hearts and in nature. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. So what does it start with? Idolatry. Therefore, after they have already become idolaters, God gave them up in the lusts of their heart to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshiped the served creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. Think about what Leviticus is. It's saying if you want to worship the Lord and be holy, you have to live this way. And look how Paul is interchanging idolatry, sexual immorality. Idolatry, sexual immorality. They're all wrapped up together. Verse 26, for this reason, God gave them up to dishonorable passions. For their women exchanged natural relations for those that are contrary to nature, and the men likewise gave up natural relationships with women and were consumed with passion for one another, men committing shameless acts with men and receiving in themselves the due penalty for their error. So this is Paul describing what I've just talked about. They've walked outside of the garden and worshiped another god, and in that space, they're choosing their own way of what is good and blessed, and the Lord has said, well, if you're over there, have at it, because you've already made the decision to not follow me. At its core, what the Lord is judging is the decision to not follow him. So though the focus of these 2 chapters is on what not to do, the Lord sums up the reason behind these verses, behind these instructions in verses 7 and 8. Consecrate, of chapter 20, consecrate yourselves therefore and be holy, for I am the Lord your God. Keep my statutes and do them. I am the Lord who sanctifies you. Remember, the word sanctify means set apart. So he's giving them instructions to follow, but what does he say? I am the Lord who sanctifies you. I am the one who sets you apart. This call to holiness is actually repeated at the end of the chapter, like we saw in verse 26. You shall be holy to me, for I, the Lord, am holy and have separated you from the peoples that you should be mine. One pastor said it this way: holiness is not only God's will, but it is also God's work. That's what this verse means. And we know, it should, if you're a hyperlink person, you're thinking about Paul's words in Philippians. It's God who works in you to will and to act according to his good purpose. The consequences seem harsh, but remember, God is being very clear. He's giving them clear instructions. He's opening up paths of life and blessing. And he's trying to, as you saw in your study in Deuteronomy 19, purge evil from their midst and deter anyone from violating these commands. So what does this all have to do with us? Well, increasingly, of course, in our culture, just like for the Israelites, our practices around marriage and family are going to separate us from our surrounding culture, and that's only going to be increasingly true. We should live differently, but not out of self-righteousness or empty moralism, but because we long to bring pieces of Eden, glimpses of heaven, into this fallen world. We are supposed to be the outpost of blessing for the world around us. And think about this: gifts of stable, thriving families. What a blessing for our culture. What a blessing. We have mental health issues among kids and teenagers are at an all-time high. What if your family, with the overflowing love that God has poured into you, extends that blessing to neighbors and friends and people around you that need a dose of stability and love and blessing in their life? We can be that outpost of salt and light, not even by what we say, but because we're demonstrating the love that is supposed to be the blessing for the world. The second thing is, just like the Israelites, Paul, of course, reminded the Corinthians that they too are their brother's keeper. The Corinthian church was harboring a relationship of an exact nature that was prohibited by these chapters in Leviticus. So this was live problem for the Corinthian church. And Paul was very explicit about the call of the church to purge the evil from their midst. Of course, after Jesus, the consequences don't include death and stoning, but out of love for the body and love for the people that were in that relationship, he does recommend a version of cutting them off. He recommends excluding them from fellowship for the purpose of drawing them back in repentance. So I think this is a little uncomfortable for us because in our culture, tolerance is the watchword of the day, and we want to be loving people, and we should be. But sometimes love is extended in difficult ways, and we're called to call each other. If someone's claiming to be in Christ, then we know what the path of flourishing and blessing is for them, and we should lovingly call them to it. The third thing that I wanted to mention is that right now, of course, the debates about homosexuality are looming really large in our culture. Maybe our culture is not even debating really anymore. That gets one verse in 18 and one verse in 20. The bulk of these chapters are setting forth a vision of marriage and family and blessing. Granted, it's in the negative, but it's setting a vision of marriage and family that's supposed to be a blessing in the world. So just keep that in mind as you think. Our culture is making that a really hot topic, and we need to be prepared and equipped to deal with that. And on that front, you saw recommended in your curriculum, there's a great book. We only have one copy of this, but if you want to flip through it and see if it applies for you, this is going to deal with all the questions we're not going to answer today. What if a person comes out to you as gay? Should you go to a same-sex wedding? All of those things are dealt with here, but that's not what our text is doing. Our text is saying, to Israel, as the set-apart people of God who are supposed to be my kingdom of priests, what is the ideal for blessing and flourishing that I want you to display to the world so that people understand who I am, right? So that people understand who I am. That is the main thing that God is after. So keep that in mind. Finally, I think while this is the path of flourishing for everyone, there is no one for whom living this way wouldn't be better. The truth is, apart from Christ, none of us can rise to this call to be holy as he is holy. Leviticus 18:5 is actually what Paul uses in Galatians, the very verse that Paul uses in Galatians 3 to say, whoops, can't do it, need Christ. This is too high a bar to bear. And if you follow the history of the Israelites out, it was too high, too much pressure, too much for them to bear. That's why Jeremiah and Ezekiel said, I'm going to solve this by giving them new hearts, hearts of flesh, hearts that have my law written on them, hearts, like Jesus said, that can from within produce life. Remember, redemption always comes before the law. So the only way that any of us could ever even inch ourselves towards this vision of blessing is because Jesus has already redeemed us. So when you're thinking about loved ones who are living outside of these paths of blessing and flourishing, their primary need is Jesus, not to change their lifestyle first. God has never laid out a vision for law first and redemption second. Redemption is always first. You know, Jay says that all the time from the pulpit, where if that's what you're wrestling with, he says, put it aside, deal with Jesus. Is he who he says he is? And do you need him? And if that's the case, the rest is going to follow. These verses I've saw in my research, they are used as bludgeons against people, and that is not making us reflect the very love, the overflowing union of love that God wants us to express. We are not expressing by using verses like Leviticus 18:22 as bludgeons. The Lord is clear about what is good, but none of us can fulfill his vision of holiness apart from Jesus. So the final thing, and I know it's been a long time, but this is really good and important. I got this from a pastor that, praise the Lord, he preached through all of Leviticus and put his sermons online. Very helpful. Look for me for 1 second in verse 11 and 12. When the Lord says, he shall surely be put to death, there's this phrase, their blood is upon them. Okay, remember, this is right after 16 and 17, when the Lord is talking about blood. And when these people walk out of Eden, their blood is their own. That's what this literally says, their blood is their own. There's no atonement, there's no blood standing in their place. But think about what Jesus has done for us. He shed his own blood. His blood was his own, so that the very consequence that's written out here, we don't have to bear. His blood is his own, and he shed it for us so that our blood doesn't have to be our own. The covenant-making creator taking all of the consequences for our adulterous treason upon himself so that we can experience resurrection life in him. So whether we have participated in these particular practices or not, we know where we stand when it comes to the Lord's call to holiness. And if you thought you could get off the hook this week, wait till next week. When the Lord says, love your neighbor as yourself, and talks about what that looks like, then we're all going to be squirming, right? We need Jesus, and thank the Lord, that's what he provided. So let's pray. Father, you are a God of grace and mercy. And the fact that this overflowing love in the Trinity would spill out into our lives at all is a miracle of grace indeed. that you delight in us, that you rejoice in us, that you delight over us with loud singing. Lord, it is too hard to grasp when we know at the same time that we cannot in and of ourselves achieve the standard of holiness and flourishing that you offer. And yet, Lord, this is what you have made available to us in Jesus. May our time in Leviticus help us love Jesus more as we realize what he has purchased for us and what he has made possible for us. May he be lifted high. May the overflowing love of the Trinity flow through us to those around us so that we can be a blessing to the world. In your name we pray. Amen.